Isn't that wonderful? Absolutely beautiful. Robin, as I was listening to you, I was thinking, what have I done with my life for the last 30 years? Focusing on science and politics, when I should have been doing something beautiful like this. It's absolutely splendid. It's one of the most beautiful things I've listened to for a long time. But then, as you were playing, I was thinking, well, actually, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Because so much of what you were playing was evoking what happens out in this beautiful world of ours. And essentially, climate change is all about disturbing the balance in this wonderful. There's so much of the evocation of nature in what you're playing. So thank you. You reminded me why I'm doing this as well. So my job is really to start a conversation with you. And I'm going to give you a few sort of contextual remarks, but then I'm going to turn to you and I'm hoping that we can have a really good conversation. Not a conversation about what climate change is, because I'm assuming that because you're here, you know, generally speaking, what climate change is all about. I am hoping that we'll focus our conversation more around what are the solutions, how are we going to address this very important challenge. But I'm particularly going to focus on what we do in the short term, because as we know, with climate change, it's all about the accumulation of gases in the atmosphere. We have a budget, a certain amount of greenhouse gases that we can accumulate within the atmosphere, and we are very close to exhausting that budget. And what we do in the next 2 to 3 years will really determine what happens into the future. What we need to do to really address climate change is to be able to bend the curve in global emissions by 2020 and then rapidly decarbonise the economy by 2050. So over this period of what is really a generation and a half, we need to essentially completely transform the way in which human civilization and development functions. And that you could feel is a daunting, horrible challenge, or you could think of it as a wonderful opportunity to create a much better world. And that's certainly the approach that we take to addressing climate change. The backstory of all of this is that in the periods, the years leading up to 2015, all of the world governments were struggling to find a solution, trying to come with an agreement, a long-term pathway, a long-term goal, and they succeeded in doing that in 2015. All of the governments made commitments to reduce their emissions at that point in time, but we are still off mark if we are going to bend the curve by 2020 and then decarbonise at that pace that we need. And so what we do in Mission 2020 is try to encourage investors, businesses, cities, states and regions to do all that they can to help national governments to make that extra bit of commitment that's required to get on the Paris pathway. When we looked at what it will take, we broke it down into 6 things, 6 simple things. The first is that we need for renewable energy to be the most competitive type of energy all around the world. And good news is, just last week, I think, an investment firm in Hamburg did the numbers and said they think that we're already there. IRENA, which is the world's renewable energy agency, earlier this year said that they think that we'll get to that point by 2020. So we feel that we're in the zone of what we need to do in the energy system to be able to make that transformation. The second area is in transport. Transport, of course, currently is very dependent on oil and burning of fossil fuels, but just over the last 6 months we've seen automakers all around the world get on the bandwagon, basically spelling the end of the internal combustion engine. There are debates as to how quickly that will happen, but the reality is we're in now a world of exponentials, and we believe that by 2020 we will see clear indications from major cities as well as from automakers that zero-emission transport is the preferred form of transport, and we will see a real take-off from that point onwards. The third area is in cities, and in the case of cities, that's where the vast majority of people will live, huge migrations into cities, and what we really need from cities is cities to have the sort of infrastructure plan which gets us to zero emissions over that period of time, and putting in very concrete measures to reduce emissions. And we're seeing that happening. The Global Covenant of Mayors, which Christiana Figueres co-chairs, has 8,000 cities that are a member of it. All of those cities have plans to be compatible with the Paris Agreement. The biggest cities in the world, which come together under the banner of what's called C40, the mega cities of the world, they all also have these Paris-compatible plans. And I think that we're seeing really serious transformations within their planning system. The fourth area is in land. I think we know that by the time we decarbonise the economy, we're going to need to be able to take, and in the years leading up to that, we're going to be taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And we need a very, very robust land system to be able to do that. I think that's one area where we're quite a long way behind, and we've got a lot of catching up to do. The fifth area is in heavy industry. Heavy industry, at this point in time, really a long way from taking any serious commitment to reducing their emissions. We're seeing some positive signals there. For example, the Mahindra Group, which is one of the big conglomerates in the world, big heavy industry conglomerates, an Indian company, just announced, was it yesterday, that all of their companies are now doing what they call a science-based target and putting in place measures so that their companies will be Paris compliant. And then the sixth area is around investment. And our assessment is that by 2020 we need to see investment flows to low carbon climate action around $1 trillion US per year. We're still a long way from that, and if I had to put all of my eggs in one basket for accelerating progress on climate action, I'd put it into that basket. But we do see huge shifts happening in the finance sector as well, in the insurance industry, in the area of issuance of bonds, for example, where we just recently launched a pledge for cities and companies to do what they call green bonds. We're seeing huge uptake and exponential growth in the green bond market, which is getting, if it continues the way it's going, will get us to our 2020 marker. So we see lots of optimistic signs that we're making progress. I think if I had to step back from that, though, the biggest transformation that I think that we've seen just in the last 5 years is that taking action on climate change is no longer seen as a burden. It used to be that all of the debates at the national level, internationally, were about burden sharing the cost of having to take this action to address climate change. But more recently that has changed, so we now see countries like India or China, or countries that may have been reluctant to take action on climate change in the past, now doing so purely out of their own economic and self-interest. And once we see that kind of alignment between what's beneficial for people economically and for the planet, I think we really start to accelerate progress. So I didn't want to say much more than that. I just wanted to give you a little bit of context for our conversation. What I would like to do is to actually encourage each of you to pause, to think about the music, and to spend a couple of moments just having a conversation with your partners in the room about what you think has come from this, what you think is important on climate. What sort of issues do you think concern you, where you are optimistic? And then I would encourage a bit of a conversation in the room. That you have a lot that you need to say because everyone has been beavering away in your conversation, so I don't mean to interrupt you, I'm sorry, but I thought maybe now who has a question or who has a thought they want to share with others? What were you talking about in your little conversations there which you wanted to share?
We're talking about Gast made by Germany.
Oh, now that's a topical
Liars, yeah.
And what could we do about the situation with cars in Germany? I mean, it's a very interesting topic because in many other parts of the world, people are getting excited by electric vehicles. I know that the other day I was in Paris at this Formula E race where it's like the Formula One, but they just use electric vehicles, and the masses of people are getting really excited about these cars. But in Germany, people have a cultural attachment to the old car. So how do we change that?
Oh, I don't know how to change. I like driving cars.
Yes.
So I hope that the industry, the cars industry, will make other cars who are good for the climate. So electric cars, for example. But now at this time it's too expensive.
And also not really climate friendly, as I've heard, because of all the batteries. They get shipped from Africa, then over to China, and then from China to America, and so on. And the CO2. It's you have so much work to do, or you have to drive so much with this car until it gets really eco-friendly that it's not really a solution to, in my opinion.
Perhaps at the moment, I think my reading is that the cost reductions for both battery technology as well as the improvements in the life cycle of batteries and the overall cost of vehicles is coming down so much for electric vehicles that they will become cheaper than the internal combustion engine vehicles by 2020. So it'll be interesting to see, sort of uptake there is. I think incentives are obviously really important for those changes, and if you look at what's happened in Norway, where the government has made that as an incentive for the shift through taxes, and you see it happen quite quickly. Other thoughts? Yes?
I think the critical problem of all this is what is the source of the energy? The carbon, the oil, or the wind or the sun? And if you use batteries, what source is the energy for the batteries?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the big part, right? The transformation of the energy system. And we've seen quite good progress in some countries. In Germany is considered to be one of the leaders, although still a long way to go here. I was just reading today that there's been some work done on storage and solar in Indonesia. Indonesia at the moment is really having a big rethink about its energy future. It is a coal-producing country, but it also is highly dependent on fossil fuels, has security concerns, and the study was looking into the pumped hydro sort of based storage combined with the capacity to bring solar in. I was at a meeting in Washington just a couple of weeks ago, and the Minister for Finance of Indonesia was there and saying she's really excited about solar because, you know, in India and in other parts in Asia, they're getting costs of solar down so low that it's much cheaper than coal or other sources. So, yes.
Well, if I stand up, well, I'm Matti Nummeri from Finland. I'm one of the government negotiators in the climate change negotiations, and I'm proud being part of putting together the Paris Agreement. But I must say that when we think about music, I got my highest promotion what the human being can get a little bit less than a year ago. I became a grandfather, and this planet is too beautiful to be destroyed.
Yes. It's a wonderful gift. I have brought my daughter Ember here, and she's a similar sort of inspiration for me, because you think about what we're passing on to our future generations. It becomes very personal, doesn't it? It's almost like the power of the music, how it can touch you. Similar the way that connection is with our children and grandchildren. Other thoughts?
I have a question because you said that your perception is that more and more governments, also from the emerging countries like India, China, and so on, they're taking action. But I'm no expert in climate change and in the discussion, but I read a bit on the internet before in preparation of this meeting, and I have the impression that, for example, the hallmarks that were defined in the Kyoto Protocol and also the Kyoto II Protocol, they were much more mandatory, or there were much firmer criteria or obstacles that had to be taken. While, for example, the Paris Agreement, it's I'm not going to say it's a bit more. Well, it gives more leeway. For example, governments themselves, they have to define what actions they're going to take, and many. From what I took from my brief review or research, not too many governments, I think also the German government, I'm not sure, they haven't defined yet the aims or what they're going to, trying to meet, the goals they're trying to meet.
Yeah.
So is it really, I'm not sure, but is it really your perception that more and more countries are taking action, or is it rather repressing?
I mean, I think there are two things that you are putting in. There's a bit of a double question. in the way that I understand what you're saying. I think the logic of the Paris Agreement is that the idea that you can force governments to abide by some sort of planetary-wide timetable for emission reductions was not going to work because key governments would not let their sovereignty bend that much. So the theory of change within the Paris Agreement is that progress will be accelerated if you can align economic, political, social interests with taking action on climate change on one hand. And so a lot of the work that happened in the lead up to Paris was about exploiting that dynamic between what happens in the real economy and what happens politically. And it is a bit of an experiment in the sense. We are currently about to go into the first sort of cycle of that process where this year governments are going to take stock of their collective efforts. At the same time, the real economy will be doing the same, the cities, the states, regions, the businesses, investors. And then the idea was that, informed by that, national governments would come forward with more ambition in 2020, and that they would do that in response to their own national circumstances. I think, I don't know if you've been to New Delhi or Beijing, but you just can't live in Delhi. The air pollution is just so dreadful. It is horrible. I have a good friend who I worked with on the Paris Agreement, Lavanya Rajamani, I don't know if you know her, but she has a young child there, and she tells them most of the time, their child is locked up inside. So there are other drivers, I think, which are going to cause countries, particularly in the developed world, to take action, which will have climate benefits, and that sometimes they will be more dramatic drivers of change than some sort of global moral imperative to act. But it's there's a risk that it won't come through. I think that we have to make that a success, and there's a real power in optimism. It's not just some sort of loose idea. There's a power in it. That's actually how markets function, right? If you think about how markets function, they function based on expectations of growth or benefit into the future. And so I think there's a bit of a psychology that's being used on climate action in a similar way. Other thoughts? Comments? Yes.
I just wanted to say that my friend she goes to New Delhi, I think every year or something, and it's just the air was so bad that she threw up twice, just the first 30 minutes she got there. And I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Imagine we're quite lucky where we live, aren't we? But even in Bonn or in other cities in Germany, this goes back to the discussion around the vehicles. We have air pollution levels of fine particulates, which can go into your lungs and can cause damage to your lungs and long-term problems. So there are even in countries like Germany, there are good reasons, public health reasons, to make this transition as well. Yes?
I think that we have to change lifestyle, and that we have to talk about degrowth concepts and ride the bike, traveling less by airplane. So that is the only step that we can do, and consuming less. So what shall we do? If we talk about the cars, electric cars, then the industry is producing, spending energy in order to produce, and it's all new products are dependent on spending more energy.
Yeah. What do others think about that? I think there is a shift that I see happening towards that type of lifestyle. But on the other hand, if you look at the statistics of the entire global population, that's not happening. So in parts, there is that sort of shift. I think particularly with the younger generation, there tends to be that. But on the other hand, we also see this allure of wanting more and more. Matthew.
Andrew, yes, so I'm, 2020, that's like 17 months away. And, I think the changes are happening, but the changes that we need to be talking about need to be pretty seismic within that period. And I'm just wondering how we're going to get over the line quickly enough to meet the scale of the challenge. And I guess, you talked at the opening about how all of us here probably get climate change, that's why we're here. But I wonder how many of us are actually doing the things that lady just mentioned, like that will actually contribute to the climate-safe world that we need. And I therefore wonder, what's really going to make the penny drop, and what role can music play in maybe getting to that kind of exponential public awareness that I think we require to go the distance.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at this in two ways, I think, Matthew. One is doing the maths and being very analytical about what needs to happen in the next 17 months, which is one very legitimate way of looking at things. And if you do that kind of calculus, then what happens in Southeast Asia and Asia on energy choices around particularly the use of coal for power generation makes a material difference on the entire equation. It makes a massive, it's the biggest factor in the whole equation. So if you had to choose where to focus your energy, you'd focus on what happens in the following countries on their energy policy: China, India, Vietnam, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Philippines, and a couple of others. Turkey, by the way, is also important. The other way of looking at it is that we are preparing ourselves in the next 17 months for a journey of transformation. And in a sense, that longer-term preparedness for change is more important than what happens in the short term, even though mathematically we really do need that to happen as well. So I think we go for the first as much as possible, and there's lots that we can do to influence that. The investment dimension is really fundamental, but there's a big political dimension to it as well. But the preparedness for change is something that we can all contribute to. So I think it's going to be tough. We will have a lot of work to do, but I'm at least confident that it's worth a try. Yes.
Are you going to be here in 2 years and give us a report?
I'd be very happy to be here in 2 years, particularly if Robbin will be playing for us again. So, unless anyone else has other thoughts, then I'd be very happy to hand back to you. Thank you.
you.